Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network. Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over. Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you'd get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
Jess, welcome onto the Australian Finance Podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
It is wonderful to have you in the studio. We're recording in Sydney today, and Mel is also joining me.
Yes, I'm super excited and super excited to have Jess on as well.
Now, Jess, you're a portfolio manager at Global X. That's a pretty interesting role. I don't think we've had any ETF portfolio managers on the show, so I'm excited to hear about your journey into investing and what day-to-day looks like for you and learn some of your lessons working in the industry. But if you could just introduce yourself to our listeners, give us the 30-second who is Jess, what would that be?
So my name is Jess Leung. I'm an ETF Portfolio Manager. I work at Global X. I've been in finance for close to 10 years now. And throughout my journey, I've done active funds, passive funds, index funds, and now I've ended up at ETFs. I really enjoy what I do because I feel like I get a chance to help your everyday investor with their investing and money, because I'm the one that's actually investing it into the underlying assets for them. So that's what I really enjoy. And in my spare time, I have a social media on Instagram and TikTok on the Leung way, where I educate about financial literacy and ETFs.
Wonderful. We'll make sure to include a link to that in the show notes as well. But if you take us back to the start of your journey in finance, back to, I don't know, whether it was for high school or uni or further past that, can you share a bit about what got you interested in finance?
So I guess my first ever memory of finance or investing was actually my grade 3 teacher. So she gave us a task. Back then it was when the stock prices were still physically printed on newspapers. So, there was no apps or phones where you can check the live pricing. And so she gave everyone a photocopy of that sheet with the last prices of the stocks. And she's like, okay, imagine you have $10,000. How would you invest that? So that was kind of my first ever experience on choosing stocks and running essentially a paper portfolio. And that's what got me interested. And then during high school, during doing economics or commerce, I think that topic was called, that got me interested. And then now when it was time to pick uni subjects, I was like, okay, I guess I'll do something to do with finance. So I applied finance, and I didn't know really what else I wanted to do at that point in time, but I knew I was interested in finance. So something related was actuarial studies. So that's why I studied that.
That's a pretty hard course, isn't it?
Yeah. And then how did you make the move from studies to portfolio management? Can you talk us through that a bit?
So I guess kind of going back, I never thought I would end up being a portfolio manager. And I guess that's kind of not the problem, but the fact that it's just, you just don't know what's out there in terms of finance. And then what was often portrayed, even when I was a kid, when I imagined myself doing finance, was probably an investment banker, because that's all you see in movies, kind of the Wolf of Wall Street, or when they're actually on the stock exchange being a stockbroker or a bank teller. So I guess you don't really know what your options are out there. And then when I was studying, like I said, I was doing actuarial studies, and that was more on the insurance side. So when it kind of got to the mathy side and the life tables and all that, I was like, this really isn't for me. So that's when I decided, okay, let's go down the applied finance and try to go down the finance route there. So from there, my first job out of uni was in operations. So that was at Macquarie, and I guess that one was more of a role where I dealt with the trades that were being done by the portfolio managers. And then from that day, I was like, I want to be the one making those decisions, not just the one that's doing the back end of those. And that's where I decided that that's what I wanted to do.
And it's interesting because a lot of people at uni, active management is the popular thing along with investment banking. A lot of students go, I want to invest in stocks and build a portfolio and things like that. But you've actually gone down the passive investing route and you're managing ETFs. So I'd be interested to hear when you sort of discovered the idea of passive investing and investing in ETFs and what sort of pivoted your journey in that direction.
So I guess what pivoted my journey in that direction was actually during COVID. that was with the rise of the passive investor and the rise of ETFs. And for me, having worked in active funds and having worked in index funds, what I really liked about ETFs was how it really democratized investing for everyone. You know, it made investing accessible. So back then, even when I was younger, when I was interested in investing, there was just managed funds. And then the barrier to entry was so much higher. You probably needed 10, 15,000 to invest. And, you know, for a
quite
20
lengthy forms too.
yeah. And for a 20-something-year-old, that's a lot of money. And then you go down the path of which fund to choose, which fund manager, and what does all that mean? And then your brain just kind of fries up and you're like, I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. So then more often than not, that's why probably most people don't end up investing until they're later. But through ETFs, I just really like the idea how it's just made it accessible so that everyone can invest.
I agree completely. That's why I love ETFs. Now, for full disclosure, Jess and I used to work together. So I do know kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis. But for all of our listeners and for Kate, can you kind of walk us through a day in the life of an ETF portfolio manager?
Yeah, so the role of a portfolio manager is managing the portfolio. So what that means for a passive fund is making sure that the fund, the underlying holdings and its performance tries to mirror the index as much as possible. So you might think, oh, that's very straightforward, like you just kind of buy what the index does. But in reality, I guess an index is very frictionless. You know, there's no transaction cost involved. There's no corporate actions. It's just it is here from day one, and then day two it looks like this. But whereas in real life, we often know real life doesn't always go as planned. There's always stuff that comes up. So there might be, like I said, index rebalances, corporate actions. I need to manage the cash. And then if we get creations or redemptions, that is more people coming into the fund or people coming out of the fund, then I actually need to physically go and buy or sell the underlying assets. So that's one part of my job. Another part of my job, which I really like as well, is product development. So that's actually thinking and going out there, seeing what our investors are wanting, what's missing in the market, and then going to work with index providers to develop a product, or essentially that will end up as an ETF that you would invest in.
Yeah, because the indexes don't always exist for what you want to put out.
Yeah, so I guess the ones that you probably are most familiar with is broad market cap indices, so kind of like the S&P/ASX 200 indices. So that's the largest 200 stocks listed on the ASX. But here at Global X, we're more of an innovative brand. We believe in thematic investing. So thematic investing is where it's sector and country agnostic. So you believe in these actual structural changes that would change the economy and the way you live your life going forward. So one example is our fund ACDC, that's the ticker, and that's the Global X Battery Tech and Lithium ETF. So that has a thematic to lithium, battery, and ultimately it plugs into electric vehicles as well. So I find that really exciting and interesting.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's a big role because I know I was talking to Monique, our producer, last year about what an ETF manager actually does, because a lot of us invest in ETFs, but we don't really know what's happening behind the scenes. And ETF managers do a lot more than just provide that product on the market for you to buy and sell on a daily basis.
And then I guess with the amount of products out there, we don't just look after one fund. So majority of the time we have our hands in all sorts of funds. So as of now, I personally cover our thematic equity funds, broader equities, fixed income and commodities as well.
Very busy. I just wanted to kind of go back just about some of the things that you're doing. Something that maybe our listeners won't know about is what about portfolio rebalancings actually are. So maybe if you want to just talk us through that quickly.
Yeah, so that goes back to the index methodology. So even we can go back to the S&P/ASX 200 index. So there's essentially the index methodology is a set of rules, and that rules defines what the universe of the stocks is. So essentially what stocks get chosen, how they get chosen, and how frequently they get chosen. So that index, I think, is a quarterly rebalance. That means it rebalances on the third Friday of every calendar quarter. So March, June, September, December. And there's rules that dictate what stocks get in it. So the largest 200, but then there's often buffering rules. So if they fall below stock rank 220, this is just an example, then they get kicked out. So what that means is that when we rebalance a fund, we actually need to make sure that our holdings match with the index post rebalance. So that means deleting the names that got removed from the index and then adding names back into the fund that got added to the index.
Yeah, and that's an interesting part of rebalancing that not everyone realizes, is that when you buy your ETF today, what the companies that are inside it will look very different 10 years time because the ETF provider continues to rebalance it. So you're always investing in sort of that best representation of the index, and you're not holding a bad company that no one wants anymore in 10 years time.
Yeah. So for those broad market cap indices or just market cap weighted indices, so that just means the weight of the stock in the index is determined by its size on the exchange. So shares outstanding times the last price. You can think of it as index essentially like a leaderboard. So you're always investing in the top 50 names and that just gets, updated as you go. So just by investing in that, you don't need to do anything, which is, I guess, the beauty of ETFs. It's very easy. Once you're in, you're in. No more work needs to be done other than if you want to continue investing in that fund. But we as a portfolio manager, we take care of everything for you behind the scenes.
Yeah, I love that. And the leaderboard is a good analogy because that's one of the great things about ETFs is how transparent they are. And if I want to know what's inside the ACDC ETF, for example, I just go to the Global X website, hit up that ETF, and I can see a list of holdings. And if I really want, I can see every single one.
Yeah, so that's a good thing about passive ETFs is transparency. You know exactly what you're getting yourself into. The most passive ETF issuers is update their holdings on their website daily, whereas more active funds, they do it on more periodical, more, not so often basis.
I suppose being an expert in the ETF space, you kind of touched on this with how beneficial, how easy investing in ETFs are. Do you have any advice for someone who's starting out investing or maybe thinks that they don't have enough knowledge or enough money or any kind of limiting belief? Do you have any advice for them?
So I like how you worded it. It's a limiting belief. So I'm just going to call it out. It's imposter syndrome. So now I guess with the rise of micro investing apps and with the rise of ETFs, investing is for everyone. It's very accessible. You don't need a lot of money to start. With micro investing apps, you can start, I think, with as little as $50. And then with ETFs, there's a lot of information out there available. There's great platforms like this podcast, yourself, and ETF issuers provide a lot of great content on their website, which is very educational. And even there's lots of great forums and communities where you can learn a lot about investing. But often the hardest part is to just get started. So that might look different for everyone. So maybe what I often say that if you're scared of doing that, you don't have to commit a lot of money. Maybe just start off with a little bit, get yourself used to the act of investing. So know what it feels like to actually press buy on, when you're actually buying a share, because that's a question I often get is, okay, I've decided I want to invest, but now I'm on the website. And so how do I actually physically enter the trade and buy it? So once you kind of get the motion and it's like muscle memory, you get used to it and then you can refine your portfolio and your investing from there.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing because you don't buy, just say you found the ETF on the website, you don't just buy it through the website, you have to open a brokerage account. So there's a few extra steps involved and people can often be quite overwhelmed by that process. And
so even if you start small, you don't really have to commit to it if it doesn't go well. At the end of the day, you're not stuck with it for life. If you really decide, looking back, that really might not have been the best one for my risk profile or what I'm after in terms of investment returns, you can sell it and you can just start again.
Do you remember when you made your very first investment in an ETF?
Oh, in an ETF? That was quite a few years ago, but I would say I would have liked to start earlier. And that's kind of the thing that I've heard.
That's what everybody
says. So I guess when I did want to start investing, my first ever investment was not an ETF. It was a single stock. But looking back, I wish I started earlier.
Yeah, and if someone's listening now and they haven't made their first investment in an ETF or anything really, and they're looking at the website and they're just not really knowing where to start, what would you say are the most important things to know about an ETF? If you're researching one.
So maybe when you're researching one and there are a lot of options out there. So analysis paralysis, some starting points to kind of kick off your thought process or your research process is maybe what are your values? Do you want to start investing based on your values? That's one option you can go down. Another option is what is the most common investment out there. So that's in terms of fund size or the most ones that you hear often. And you can start off with a broad market cap index, say.
Yeah, it's an interesting place to start as well. And that's where you started, didn't you?
I started with IWLD.
Oh, yes. We talked about on the show a few weeks ago, didn't we?
Exactly. But since that, I started to do, kind kind of broader indexes before going into thematics.
Yeah, because that's one way that we like to say is the core satellite portfolio. So the core of your portfolio is based on broad market cap index ETFs. And then if you like your satellites, which are a smaller proportion of your fund, they can be either stock names that you like or thematics or sectors, then that way you can tilt your portfolio differently. But at the end of the day, the majority of the core of your portfolio is based on broad index ETFs.
And that must be a pretty cool part of your job. Because you're working in the ETF space, you're actually creating products that brand new investors can use to get started. Because if you worked in active funds management, a lot of these funds have $10,000 or $25,000 minimums. So a lot of people can't use these products at the beginning of their investing journey. So it must be cool to see so many people using ETFs to get started with.
Yeah, and that's what I really like. I guess that's what gives me almost, you can say, a sense of purpose. I like that I'm contributing to people's wealth journey, and I find that really motivating for me personally.
I love that. And I suppose moving on from that, you're making a contribution to kind of women in finance as well. You're one of the very few female portfolio managers for a passive provider. So how has that journey been for you? How has it progressed over the last few years? Where do you see the industry going?
Yeah, so I would say along my journey, my personal journey, I haven't actually had many female portfolio managers on my path. I would say I've just had one, and she's been a great mentor. We're still very close. We're still very connected. But just in general, yeah, women and other minorities are really underrepresented in finance. And then when you go one step deeper into investment roles, that's even less. So I think according to Morningstar, the percentage of female fund managers across the world globally is less than 20%.
Wow.
And I would even dare say in Australia, it's probably less than 10, just based on my personal experience. Yeah, so I guess the question then we have to ask is, why is there not more, right? So is that a question of, do they not know about it? Is that just something that they don't like? Or is the environment not suitable? Or are we not doing enough to encourage young women to come into this industry? And then it becomes a question of, how can we change that?
Do you have any thoughts on those questions? Because they're good questions.
I think, yeah, so much to unpack here. But personally, I think it's a bit of everything. So going back even to my personal journey, I just wasn't aware that portfolio management, or now more specifically an ETF, was a possible career path. So I guess that's one of the reasons as to why I do my social media, to be the representation that I wish I had growing up, and to just let people know this is a possible career path and it's very rewarding, and that if you want to do so, here are the steps that you can take to do that. Another thing is building the pipeline, which I think there are many great initiatives out there now that are doing that. So, going to high schools, going to unis and recruiting them from a younger age. But if we look at the numbers now in terms of graduate roles and finance across the board, it is split quite evenly at 50-50, but then it's more when you move up to when they're mid-career and then C-suite, and that number just tapers off dramatically. So I guess it's a multi-pronged approach. So how do you build the pipeline? And then how do you retain the talent? And then how do you progress that talent?
And it's definitely a role that I didn't know existed before I started working in finance. And so there is a great benefit to actually speaking to people in high school and university and actually going, investing's a thing, also passive investing's a thing, and you can work in finance. And we were talking off air about all the different roles in finance, because we often think finance is those media pictures where there's a bunch of guys in a pit in lab coats just running around yelling. And that's really not true, especially in Australia. That doesn't exist anywhere. And I was wondering if you could chat, because you've worked in a few different roles in finance, about just the broad range of roles that people can be involved in. Yeah,
so even if you look at even the big banks, they do so much more than just your deposits and your home loan. So you can have a look on their website. There's lots of different branches. So what I do in ETF, the broader arm is asset management. So that's wealth management, investing in funds. And then there's the retail side, which we mentioned, that's your deposit taking side. And then there's also the institutional banking side. So that's where you deal with, for example, your super funds or stuff that businesses do with one another. And then you also have investing such as commodities and much, much more. So it's actually a whole range. And within that, there's all these different roles. So even within asset management, there is back office. So that's operations. That's where I started. And then risk management. So that was my second role. Now we call it as middle office, and then front office. Yeah, which is a portfolio management role.
And it's got everything there. Like if you work in marketing or events or law or human resources or operations or technology, there's roles for everybody in finance. And I think if it somewhat interests you, it's a great industry to work on because you get to learn so much about the world around you.
So that's why I guess it's so important. As we say, investing is for everyone, and a key to that is accessibility. So, and part of that is just being the representation and letting everyone, not only women or not only younger girls, but the next generation, that these are your options, there are options, and that you can make those choices if you decide that that's what you want to do.
Do you have, so you kind of mentioned one of your role models who was another portfolio manager, but do you have anyone else that you kind of have a community of women or other people in portfolio management that you can kind of bounce ideas off, or any role models that inspire you?
Yeah, so other than that, I guess I've had some mentors and guidances along the way. I guess a tip for your listeners is networking. And not only, I guess, a lot of people say that networking is important and they often just refer to expanding your network. But I would say another aspect or another good tip is to expand your peer network. So like you said, having people in similar roles to you, similar levels to you, and so you can share your knowledge, and they act as, I would say, a very honest sounding board, of what they're going through, and then you can see and work together.
And you're probably working in such an evolving industry because ETFs have been evolving, the technology behind the scenes is evolving. You want to know what's happening, what the changes, and that helps you improve your own skills and your own role as well.
Sure. So yeah, ETFs are a disruptor of the finance industry, and I would like to think that my role as a female in the portfolio management team is a disruptor as well. We're changing the way that things are done. And I guess sometimes I look around the room and I'm like, oh, I'm the only female there. And I kind of just remind myself that that's how far I've come. So I guess another thing that I wanted to share with you today is sometimes, even though you may be different, embrace that difference. You are in that room for a reason, so don't forget it. And sometimes you might feel like, oh, I don't know how to speak up, or I don't know how to convey my point, but just remember to back yourself, because no one cares about your career more than you. You are there for a reason, so believe in yourself, and you can do it.
I love that.
Me
I love
too.
that. And it's important to have lots of different people working in finance because we want the products to be accessible to everyone. We want the platforms to be accessible to everyone. And I think the more diversity and the more range of experiences. So a lot of people come to finance from non-finance backgrounds, and that brings a whole range of different experiences as well. And hopefully it ends up creating better investment products like ETFs or better brokerage platforms for us to use on our wealth creation journey.
Yeah, when we talk about diversity, it's not just about gender, it's about everything, cultural background, and more importantly, what all that brings is diversity of thought. And research has proven that the more diverse you are, the better outcomes, and also in terms of investing performance as well. So why not?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Another interesting question, because you're working on the passive side, and I know Owen interviews a lot of active fund managers on the Investors podcast, is passive versus active. And I presume you get asked that question a little bit working in the passive side of things. What are your thoughts on where do you sit on that debate? Do you think about it can be both, or do you prefer passive investing over active investing?
So I think it can be both. And at the end of the day, I think it really depends on the investor, their own preferences and their views. So, some investors, they just know that they need to start building a nest egg. They need to know that they need to have their budget sorted, have an emergency fund, and contribute regularly to their investment to build their retirement fund. But then other than that, they don't really want to be a stock picker. They don't want to really spend the time reading the news every day, doing the research. And that is okay. That is completely fine. So with that, passive is a very suitable choice for those people. Whereas on the other hand, active, sometimes the exposure that you want may not be available via passive funds. So then you have to go down the active, or that you enjoy doing that. So then you are the active manager. So I see that there's a place and a role for both in one's portfolio.
Yeah, I find that argument or that conversation really interesting, because even as a passive issuer, an ETF provider, they're still creating indexes, they're still making trades. So even though it's called passive, you're still making active decisions every day, right?
And I think a common misconception is that when we say passive, people just think of your broad market cap index funds. But no, passive is so much more than that. Like we have thematic funds and that looks nothing like your ASX 200 index. So yeah.
Yeah, I always find that conversation because people talk about passive income and not having to do any work, but there are always decisions. There's admin involved, even if it's just doing the tax return. There's some work involved in that. So are there any other resources that, especially for people wanting to work in the investment industry who are curious about what happens behind the scenes? Because it does seem a bit elusive from the outside. If someone's interested in learning more about a career or a role in investing, are there any places you'd direct them?
So personally, I guess just drawing back on my experience, when I started in operations and then I decided that I wanted to be the ones making those decisions, I kind of went back and asked myself what skill sets I need. So that's why I decided to take the CFA or do the Chartered Financial Analyst program. So that's many years of studying.
Did you do all 3 levels?
Yes, I did all 3 levels.
It's one of the hardest things in Australia to do, isn't it?
I think it's hard because back then I was also having a full-time job.
Yeah.
So it's the work-life balance and your time management. So I respect anyone that has a CFA because of the time management aspect. But yeah, so doing that I think helped significantly because that gave you exposure to lots of different aspects of finance. And then secondly, if you do or you are curious, then maybe going back or drawing on your network and see if you know anyone that can put you in touch. So I remember before my first interview, I had one of my brother's friend who worked at Macquarie. So we went out for a coffee and I asked him all these questions, and yeah, I thought that was really helpful.
Yeah. No, the CFA website's great. I'll link it in the show notes because it has a lot of research and articles and reports on different aspects of investing. And I've used a few of those resources just for research for the podcast over the years. So it's a good place to start. And they probably run some university events as well.
Yeah, I think they do. They have a broad network and events as well. And I guess another one is if you are interested in investing, one question that I always ask the person in the interview is, do you invest personally? So I think that adds a lot of brownie points. It shows that, you are actually interested and that you've done the process. And yeah, I always say that the best way of learning is by doing. So
I'm going to ask you that question. Do you invest personally, and what do you like to invest in?
I do. So I guess my personal investing journey has evolved a lot since my first ever single name stock investment. I won't disclose what exactly I invest in, but I think it's more my mentality around investing has changed. So back when my first one, it was more, okay, let's put all this money into this one name and hope it does really well. And guess what? It did not. So
So you learnt to diversify.
Yeah, so I learned to diversify, and then that's where the beauty of ETFs come in again, diversification. You can get that in one simple trade. So with that, so that's now the core of my portfolio. And then I still do some single stock names investing, but that's more of a satellite or more what my personal interests are in terms of the sectors and what I want to invest in. So I just put a little bit of money in those names. And yeah, so my strategy is actually now set and forget almost. So just put some away every single month. And if there's something that interests me, then I would allocate a little bit. But it's always set and forget, just build it, and then also diversify.
So just because you're in funds management doesn't mean you're spending your whole weekend also learning about investing in companies.
Yeah, well, I guess that's kind of what I do. I read so much during work as well, so kind of form ideas. But mainly, I guess maybe because I do work in it so much that I do kind of want to break or take a bit of the mental load off.
Fair enough.
So just kind of, do the easy way, set and forget. And if there's something that genuinely interests me, then I will spend more time to go and do it.
Jess, we've covered a lot of ground today, but if you wanted listeners to take one thing away from this conversation about working in investing, about ETF investment management, what would that be?
So maybe some takeaway for your listener that's just broader than just working in finance, maybe some broader career advice.
Yeah, absolutely.
I kind of have 3 things that I kind of stick to is that no one cares about your career more than yourself. So back yourself. So what does that look like? So that looks like believing in yourself. And that the second thing is I personally don't believe in the saying, fake it till you make it. that's imposter syndrome. And I think that if you tell yourself fake it till you make it, it implies that it's something that you're not.
Yeah.
When it actually is something that you are. So I just like to kind of change that mindset to what would the most confident or what would the best version of me act in that scenario, and try to channel that.
Yeah.
So that is the version of backing yourself as well, believing that you can. And I think many of you have probably heard that saying where females don't apply for a job if they feel like they only tick 7 out of the 10 criteria. Or no, if they don't tick all 10,
Yeah.
when males do so, even if they only tick 7 out of the 10. But for me, it's not that you're not there yet. What you need to believe in is you need to ask yourself, am I able to pick up those skills? Can I learn? Because I often think that learning on the job is the best way and the fastest way. And not only that is, are you willing to put in the time and effort to learn, and will you actually follow through with that? So if you're confident in your abilities to do that, then why not go for it? And yes, lastly is a second form of backing yourself is find your voice. So this might seem very funny, but even to this day, if there's a big meeting or a presentation coming up, how do you build the confidence to go into that room? And I'll share a little secret. I still do power poses in front of the mirror sometimes, but that it's scientifically proven to help.
Yeah.
But that, and going back to what I was saying before, is sometimes just remember how far you've come. You know, you were chosen to be in that room based on your talents, and back yourself. Yeah.
Some great career advice there.
Absolutely. I think sometimes it is hard to take a step back and go, oh, this is how far I've come and I belong here.
Yeah.
But that's great advice.
Yeah. So most of the time it's in our head. So just take a deep breath and just kind of go from there.
Wonderful. And a lot of that can be applied to taking your first step on your investing journey as well. Because at some point you do have to believe that you've got the skills and the knowledge and the tools in front of you to take that first step, and it doesn't need to wait another 5 years.
No. And often it's always the first step that's the hardest. But once you're there, then you kind of look back and go, oh, that wasn't that hard. All right. So then let's keep going.
Yeah. Jess, if people want to learn more about you and Global X and maybe look under the hood about some of those ETFs and see some of those holdings on the leaderboard, where should they go? Yeah, so to find out more about our ETFs, you can visit our website. So it's globalxetfs.com.au. We have great content and information there. And if you want, you can just type in the fund ticker, or, there's a drop down where you can see all our funds. And then you can look under the hood to go see the holdings. And if you're interested to learn more about me, you can find me on my personal social media. So I'm on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube, and that's under the handle The Leung Way. So TheLeungWay. Wonderful. Well, we'll include links to all of those resources in the show notes, plus our ETF mini series. So if ETFs are a brand new concept to you, we'll include a link to that series as well. Jess, thank you so much for joining Mel and I on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It was so much fun.